Hello, and welcome to episode 21 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. Today on the podcast, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Roman Frigg, Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method, Director of the Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science, and Co-Director of the Center for the Analysis of Time Series at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Roman holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of London and master's degrees both in theoretical physics and philosophy from the University of Basel in Switzerland. Roman's research interests lie in general philosophy of science and philosophy of physics, and he has published papers on numerous topics, including climate change, quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, randomness, chaos, complexity, probability, scientific realism, computer simulations, modeling, scientific representation, reductionism, confirmation, and the relation between art and science. Roman's current work focuses on the nature of scientific models and theories, the foundation of statistical mechanics, and most recently, predictability and climate change. Increasingly, climate models are used to make high-resolution forecasts about future changes in our immediate environment. An important question, however, is do such forecasts provide policy-relevant information? Given the systematic errors in current climate models, treating model outputs as a basis for decision-making can be misleading. Roman argues that we have to relinquish unreasonable demands for detailed long-term projections and instead think about policy-making under conditions of uncertainty. So this is a topic that Roman and I get into in the second half of the interview in detailing his research on climate science, as well as some of the challenges facing philosophy of science. And I really appreciate the view that Roman espouses, which is a sensible middle ground, that while he certainly is anything but a climate skeptic, he's someone that says that when it comes to climate science, scientists should be honest about what we can and can't do. Namely, that we can't forecast absolutely everything with our particular models, and that one should communicate clearly what these particular uncertainties in the climate data are. So for more on this, and without further ado, let's bring in Roman. Okay, well, let's start back from the beginning. I'm interested to hear, Roman, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Basel in Switzerland, which is by Swiss standards a big city, but by international standards a very small one. It has about 200,000 people.
Okay.
But compared to the place where my family is from originally, that's already humongous. So my father is from a little village in the Swiss mountains, which, well, when we last counted, had about 35 dwellers.
Wow! What did that's quite interesting.
It has actually, to my great chagrin, recently been stripped of its status as a village. So when I was a kid, it had a postcode and a post office, but obviously they figured it wasn't worth the trouble for the 35 people. So it's now only a hamlet, and
so if there were 35 dwellers,
goes to the next bigger village.
Well, so I'm curious. So what if it's stripped as a status as a village? Is it an outpost? What is the next level down, or next status of gathering?
Yeah, it's a German-speaking area, so we would call it a Weiler. But I think the English equivalent would be a hamlet.
Okay. And so, did you visit that visit the villages as a child? I spent
a lot of time there when I was young. So it used to be great in winter. You could go skiing. Mm-hmm. You would save the family money by just going to your family house where you could live for free.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if there were 35 dwellers, what did your father? I suppose what did your grandparents do?
Well, my grandmother was what women of that generation did. She was a housewife. Mm-hmm. and my grandfather was the carpenter of the village, and probably the few villages next to it.
Wow.
So he built pretty much anything you can make from wood, from chairs to big Swiss chalets. So our family house, for instance, was a big 3-story chalet that he built himself.
Wow, that's something. And so you grew up in Basel, or Basel. What were your parents doing?
My father was a research scientist. He studied biology and then worked in research.
Oh, okay.
My mother, so for the first 12 years of my life, was a housewife. And then she took up a position in the social welfare system of Switzerland.
Oh, okay.
That was a part-time job. So she took care of people who were supported by the welfare system, and also refugees and homeless people.
Wow. How did she like that?
I think she thought it was an interesting and challenging job.
I can imagine, yeah.
And I guess she came to see that her 2 sons were actually not as bad as she thought they were.
So you did you grow up? You had a brother?
Yeah, I have a younger brother. Yeah.
Oh, great. So were you guys? How did you relate then to your dad in terms of him being as a research scientist? Was this something of interest as growing up, or was?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess in various ways, both of us have been very much influenced by my father's interest. Even though he was a biologist, he sort of was a bit of a maths freak. Mm-hmm. So when the first personal computers became available, so he brought one home and started programming fractals.
Oh.
That sort of stayed with me, I guess. And my brother became a medic, so he inherited my father's interest in biology and anatomy. Mm-hmm. So I guess in sort of different ways we sort of, were strongly influenced by him. My father was a very powerful figure, so... Something stuck.
Yeah, but beside biology, you have come to focus on physics and theoretical physics.
Yeah, biology and chemistry never resonated very much with me, so I liked sort of the mathematical physics side of things, but I guess you can't always do exactly what your parents do.
No, you got to differentiate. Yeah, of course. Is there? Can you think back to? Is there any memory or experience you can recall from growing up that resonated in terms of your interest in mathematics or physics or is there something back then? I'm not sure there is sort of any sort of particularly determinant experience. Sure.
So I think really sort of fractals were sort of a discovery. I mean, I was a teenager when my father got his personal computer and told me about the strange thing called fractals, and he spent night after night in the computer changing the algorithm a bit and changing the color scheme a little bit, and sort of these things were very slow, so you'd basically...
Sure. No, yeah, so what did you try? What were you...
Going in the evening and then look at it in the morning. And so that was a bit of family fun for a while. And sort of even at the time I thought this was terribly silly and couldn't understand what the man was after. And sort of, I guess it spiked my interest in these things a little bit. And then we had a relatively good maths and physics teaching in school. So... I think my school teachers were sort of an inspiring influence on me in that regard. So we had one of those proverbial crazy physicists was my physics teacher in secondary school, and compared to sort of other dull subjects, I thought physics was really funky. And I think that sort of also influenced me positively.
Very nice. What about did you have any other interests at the time? Other things that you like to do, or?
Yeah, I was actually a very unintellectual a teenager. Well, some of my interest started setting on when I was sort of 16, 17. But before that, I think I did mainly handiwork. So from my grandfather, I sort of inherited the interest in manual work. So I did a lot of woodwork and carpentering. Oh, nice. Learned how to do chairs and drawers. And then, sort of as I grew a bit older, meaning 9, 10, 12, sure. So I got into doing remote-controlled models. So maybe if you're a psychoanalyst, you can sort of trace back modeling to this era of my life. So I started with cars and ships, and then branched out to remote-controlled aeroplanes. Although I have to admit that this was slightly less successful. The air is much smaller there. The thing has to fly.
Have you since gone and played with drones now? Have you seen these?
I must admit that this interest faded out entirely.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
I haven't maintained any of this. I'm not having a model railway at home at all.
That's fair. So you don't have a secret basement with trains going on and everything?
No, none of this going on, unfortunately. Maybe it would be a good thing to do.
Sure.
Bricolage in your cellar every now and then, but no, I don't have anything like it. The other thing I did was playing music.
Oh, okay.
So I played the trumpet, and that sort of became increasingly important. So when I was 13, I think I joined the local marching band in the village just outside Basel, where my family lived. And then, well, that at some point seemed a bit coarse. So I became member of the Basel Youth Symphony Orchestra when I was 16.
Wow. Playing the trumpet?
And then played a lot of smaller formations as well, so brass quintets and trumpet and organ in church. So for someone with my metaphysical worldviews, that's a bit unusual, I guess. But that's I guess the one aspect about church that I like is the music. So I
was this a Catholic church or which?
I was completely promiscuous here. I mean, whoever would want to have me to play got it. So there was a quite lively music scene when I was young. I mean, these were sort of the late 80s and the early 90s. There was a lot of money around, and sort of every church had their organ player, and the organ players like to have someone play with them. So if you pack the trumpet and say I can play Bach, they were happy to have you. So I played for weddings, funerals, Easter, Christmas, or some other Sundays. So that was quite
wow. So that that's something. So did you at the time as playing music, was professional musician in sight? Was this something you were?
Yeah, that's something I seriously considered. So I did sort of the preparatory courses for conservatory, and sort of did my solfege and my music theory and all the rest of it. But then, well, I didn't actually go to conservatory, so you some point have to be realistic about your own talents. So
sure.
I was a perfectly okay musician for the local church, but I don't think I would have made a grand career out of playing trumpet. So I figured I was better at physics.
It's difficult. The conservatories are extremely competitive, and it's a choice. I mean, it's a lifestyle in terms of the practice requirements.
Like everything. So I mean, it's like university. I mean, you just have to be good to make a living out of it. And I mean, I knew that I wouldn't want to be sort of the music teacher in the local music school. I mean, if I was to become a musician, I really wanted to play. And you have to be very good for this, and I just wasn't good enough.
I understand.
I realized that early enough, so it's okay.
Okay, so you did you go to your undergrad at university out of secondary school?
No, we do that thing called gymnasium in Switzerland, which I guess translates into high school. And we go there for quite a while. So you go to secondary school until you're 16, and then we had another 4 years of gymnasium. So I was 20 when I got my high school degree. And then I went to university. So I went to Basel University. That's what the Swiss kids did at the time. You just went to your local university because the idea was all universities are the same. So unfortunately, that didn't serve me badly. Actually, my local university was quite all right.
That's great. Yeah.
So, and this was before the time of rigorous curriculum design and stern controls of whether you were actually there or not. So what I did is I'm registered both in philosophy and in physics. So I did what they call a Doppelstudium, sort of a double studies. And I did both physics and philosophy as majors with their sort of minor subjects coming to it. So I did then mathematics and sociology as minors.
So what drew you to philosophy, doing this particular double majoring in philosophy and physics? Yeah, it was a two-way path into it, really. So I had an independent interest in philosophy. So in my late teens, I started reading Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and had my first misunderstandings of Kant. And sort of found all that very fascinating. Sure. Then also I went to study physics, and doing equations is fun, and I think I was reasonably good at it. But then I always felt that this wasn't everything. So I always wanted to know what's behind the equations, and what do the equations do, and what sort of worldview do these equations convey, and sort of what makes physics tick. And sort of my physics professors always had a certain unease about these questions. And sort of, I think Feynman once said, well, physics is basically shut up and calculate. And sort of this mentality was very strong. Sort of experimental physicists, they thought I should just go to the lab and do my experiments and measure the elementary charge or clean the vacuum pumps. And the theoretical physicists thought I should learn everything about Basel equations. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's left me sort of wanting more, in a sense. It's sort of, I really wanted to know what this was all about. Did you? Then I discovered there was this field called philosophy of physics. So you didn't just learn quantum mechanics as sort of a collection of recipes that somehow work, but people actually thought about what the world would be like if quantum mechanics is true. And so I sort of discovered this whole cosmos of philosophy of science, and that was sort of really love at first sight, because it sort of allowed me to sort of bring my two interests, which were initially completely disjoint. You read Nietzsche 1 hour and you solve equations the other, but that doesn't really speak very much to each other. But then suddenly you read philosophy of science, and sort of people do philosophy and science at the same time, and then there's even philosophy of physics, and so you suddenly do philosophy and physics at the same time, and sort of this gray area is really what stayed with me until now. So. Yeah, that's what I was curious about as a double major. Did you find that you brought some of those questions from your physics courses into the philosophy room, or did you forge your own path in kind of coming up with this into this gray area? Yeah, clearly. And that was also sort of eventually the reason of me leaving Switzerland. So at the time, the philosophy scene was very traditional. Sure. So you did your courses in Hegel and Heidegger and Nietzsche and Derrida, etc., etc. Kant, if you were lucky,
And so there was practically no philosophy of science. I became the research assistant of a professor who was a Kantian, who I greatly admire. And she was very tolerant. She thought this was great to do philosophy of science and I should do it. But eventually I had to do it on my own. I mean, there were no courses sort of really you could follow. And so when it came to thinking about what I do after my diploma, so at the time you didn't have the structure of having sort of an undergraduate degree and a master. You just did a 5-year diploma, and so there you went. So when I had my diplomas in physics and in philosophy, so I had to think about where I take it, and so then I took to the internet and.
Yeah, what was next? Yeah.
That I was reading were sitting. And eventually decided I had to go to the English-speaking world to do what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. So given that the resources afforded to you in Switzerland, philosophy of science mainly in Switzerland wasn't as available, where did you go next?
Well, I wrote to Nancy Cartwright and to Wesley Salmon.
Oh, big names in the field, yeah.
I thought of nothing to lose, so you may as well try. And they both wrote very nice letters back. I'm really grateful to them still. And say, yeah, that sounds like interesting projects you have here. You're welcome to study with us. And so I was pondering back and forth between Pittsburgh and London, and eventually I decided to go to London. And I came to LSE as an exchange student first, just for a year. Mm-hmm. But then I liked it there, and somehow they must have liked me, so they accepted me as a PhD student. And I did my PhD at the LSE, so that was with Nancy Cartwright, Carl Heifer, and Michael Redhead. So these were my sort of 3 supervisors.
And for those who might not be as familiar with LSE, what can you say about the London School of Economics as it relates to the field of philosophy of science?
Well, it's a unique philosophy department in the sense that it specializes almost uniquely on philosophy of science. So we don't have any, say, classical philosophy or medieval or aesthetics or sort of any other of the philosophical subfields, which, I mean, if you just want to get a general philosophy education, may be a drawback. But if you want to do a philosophy of science PhD, that's absolutely fantastic. You're thrown into this microcosmos of people who do philosophy of science of all kind. I mean, there were the philosophers of physics and the philosophers of economics, and there were the Bayesians and people doing realism and people doing rational choice, and there was this plethora of things that you could listen to and tap into somehow, and it was a very open and nice environment. So people's doors were always open, and you could knock at their door and you could pester them with your paper, and they would actually read it. I thought it was a wonderful place to do a PhD, and there was also a critical mass of PhD students, so we had a nice community, and many of the people I studied with are still friends, and they're now philosophers of science in their own right. And so it was an absolutely great place. I loved it. So
fantastic. Can you recall any folks you studied with, any fellow graduate students who we might know?
Michela Massimi, for instance, who is in Edinburgh now, Julian Rice, who is in Durham now, Till Grune, who is in Stockholm now, Yanis Votsis, who is at the new College of the Humanities in London. Peter Deitch, who is in Montreal. These were sort of my
very nice
immediate peers.
Sure, very nice.
Yeah.
So it sounds like LSE was a really great experience for you. What kind?
Yeah, it was really a happening place, and what was also good, it has not only a department, it has the center, and the center has this visitors program, and so you had basically people walking through all the time, and you you basically got to meet the who's who in the field simply by walking up to the second floor or going into the seminar room.
Wow. And yeah, I can see it here. The Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science, is that?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's literally in the same building as the philosophy department. And that had sort of all these lectures and visitors. And, I mean, there's hardly a name in philosophy of science that wasn't there at some point. Mm-hmm. And so that was just great as a student. So you could just basically see people and hear what they had to say and sort of broaden your horizon and learn what they're up to. And I thought that was fantastic.
So, as you spent your time here, what kinds of questions were you focused on? And did they change at all as, you pursued your study?
Well, change is a gradual thing. I did my PhD on philosophy of modeling, and that stayed with me. So, I mean, I don't necessarily hold the same views about models as I did back then, but my PhD was on representation, and that's a topic that stayed with me. At the same time, I also worked on philosophy of physics, quantum mechanics, and statistical physics, mainly. So the quantum mechanics dropped out of the picture a bit. I haven't really been working on this seriously for a while, but so my interest in chaos and randomness branched out in sort of a general interest in statistical mechanics and statistical physics, and from there I got into climate modeling, sort of via my interest in nonlinear dynamics and generally mathematical modeling. So I think the basic questions actually stayed with me. Wow. Just tried to broaden out a bit and not sort of stay on the same three small things all the time.
Sure. And yeah, climate modeling, I mean, this was something that you eventually have gotten to in the past maybe 5-10 years, or is this past 5-6 years, something like that. So, and also statistical mechanics, I'm really interested in that. This is something I'm quite intensely working on at the moment. So for folks that maybe aren't particularly familiar with philosophy of physics, most general popular science books are written in terms of theoretical physics. What can you say in terms of, what is it that you were doing in terms of doing philosophy of physics as a graduate student, and maybe how that might differ from someone who's studying theoretical physics?
Well, I think it's a gradual difference. I don't think there is a principled difference, and I think the lines between physics and philosophy of physics are actually blurred, and that's how it should be. There's nothing wrong with that. So there is just a way of doing physics where you take the theories for granted and you just use them to do things. So you try to figure out what the implications of the theories are, and say you take electromagnetism and you just try to build an antenna with it, sort of at the engineering end of the applications. I mean, that's great. But you can then also ask, well, why are the equations the way they are? And what do the equations really say? And what is the basic structure that reality would have to have in order for these equations to apply in a meaningful way? And what decisions have been made when formulating the equations? And what sort of a worldview do these equations convey to you? So quantum mechanics, for instance, what does the world have to be like for quantum mechanics to be true? Is the world sort of indeterministic, as some physicists thought, or is the world deterministic after all, and quantum mechanics gives you something of an incomplete description? And similar questions can be asked about statistical physics. So how does the world have to be like for something like a statistical description of large systems to be right or to be operable? And what exactly should that description look like? In statistical physics, you have sort of the interesting situation that there is nothing like the theory. So in quantum mechanics, you actually have something like a generally accepted formula, some sort of modulo some mathematical nicety. I guess there is broad agreement on this. in statistical physics, you actually have different approaches and different schools of thought and different ways of going about it. And so this also raises general methodological questions of how do different theories or different approaches relate to each other? Do they have to be consistent with each other? Is one fundamental and another sort of effective? Or how are we to make sense of this? And that also relates to an issue in modeling. So there is this problem called the multi-model problem, so that you can represent the same target system with different models who have different structures. And it's not just that one is a refinement of the other. It's just different models that are not in any sort of obvious way intertranslatable. So how to make sense of this? And these are sort of the questions that I find fascinating to look at from a philosophical point of view. And these are, well, in a sense, they are physics questions. And some physicists worry greatly about it. I mean, Einstein spent a lot of time thinking about problems like these. So is Einstein now a philosopher or a physicist? Probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
But I think it's sort of a spectrum of blending over into sort of the more foundational issues that at some point marks a transition.
Very nice, very nice. Okay, so did you end up doing your thesis on, was it mainly on issues in modeling specifically, or was there a little bit of combination of, what was your thesis on?
No, my thesis was actually just on modeling, so very little formalism in it. So I had the schizophrenia, so I wrote my thesis on modeling, and the most advanced physics there was the Newtonian model of the solar system.
Okay.
But then I just wrote on philosophy of physics on the side. So when I finished my thesis, I basically had 3 papers in philosophy of physics finished and sort of just about being published. So one was on properties in quantum theory, one was on Kolmogorov-Sinai entropy, information theory, and one was on self-organizing complexity. So these are sort of I wrote on the side, as it were, as my academic hobby.
Is this the self-organized criticality paper I see? Or I don't know, I'm not sure. This might have been a while
that's
back.
the self-organizing criticality paper that came out in Studies then. So that's a topic I left after that. So I thought I said what I wanted to say, but I still like the paper.
Nice, very nice. Okay. All right, so what came next? How did you go about? Did you immediately go on the job market after your PhD? Did you?
Yeah, well, I was pushed onto the job market.
Yeah. Tell me about how did this all happen?
Oh, God, yes. I was just about sort of getting on with my thesis and sort of felt that I was just about getting a grip on what the thesis would look like. And sort of Nancy ordered me in her office and in her usual, very direct way said, "Roman, you will finish your PhD in half a year and you need a job."
Oh, wow.
So I didn't quite know what to say, and I took a deep breath and I said, "Well, if you think so, then
yes."
And then she said, "Well, you're writing a job prospectus and a teaching portfolio." And so she gave me the lowdown of involved, and being a diligent student, I didn't dare to object, so I just did as she suggested. And when the next round of application came, so I just did what everybody did. So you got your hands on jobs for philosophers, and you looked up what there was, and you sent your applications out. And well, I went to the APA for my interviews. I remember a miserably cold winter in Philadelphia.
Oh, gee. Yeah, the APA East.
But it so happened that there was a job available at the LSE, and I figured, given I have all my documents ready, I mean, it costs me a stamp to apply as well. So I said, I never thought I would get the job, because obviously there is this sort of prohibition against hiring graduate students.
Sure.
And then also I didn't think that they would want me. I just thought I was one of the students, and they would say, "Thank you so much. Here's a PhD, and now you get a job." So I just put in an application. I was rather surprised when I got an interview.
Wow. Okay. So were you interviewed by Nancy? How did that?
She was in the committee, but so I have to be more precise. I mean, at the LSE, it's always the whole department interviewing, so you have a committee to screen applications just for efficiency, but interviews are always with the whole department. So I just got invited to the whole department, to give my job talk and my interview, and was a bit nervous, as you can imagine.
I could, absolutely.
But then, to my great surprise, they made me a job offer. So, and then, I accepted that. And
fantastic. So
the rest is history, as they say. So
you've been studying now and teaching from the LSE.
It was really funny. I defended my thesis on a Friday, and on the Monday after I started my job. So
it's really interesting to hear also the transition folks have from moving as a doctoral student or a candidate to working, maybe perhaps even in the same place with what you were studying. How was that transition for you?
It was very smooth. I mean, my colleagues were really nice and very respectful, and I mean, they never made me feel that I was the little boy who was now somehow allowed into the club, but should know his place. So there was never anything of this, and they were all very nice, and it never was a problem. And then you basically turn around twice in life, and suddenly you're sort of in the mid-range of the faculty, as it were, because you get older and other people get hired. And at some point, it's just, your past gets screamed off. I mean, it's just, you don't think about it anymore.
Very nice.
So it's really never been a problem. So.
Good. Well, so, since being there, you've published quite a few papers. You've been the director of the center. You've done quite a bit. So editor of Philosophy of Science, or have
the British journal.
British journal. Right. Yeah.
No, I was an associate editor. That was my official
associate.
Title of the British Journal for Philosophy of Science. Yeah.
Very nice.
The LSE was a great place, and it still is, but I mean, it was a great place when I came in. So there was this real culture of helping young people and treating them well, and sort of supporting work. So there was never this idea that you basically have to take up the slack for the big guys. So there was always a sense of fair play, and there was a great deal of support available, and you could get your buyouts, and you could get your sabbaticals, and so they made sure you had time to write something. And it was a good place for me when I started my job. So.
Okay, and so maybe in those earlier years, what kinds of papers were you excited about? What kinds of work were you working on?
Well, I sort of had a bit of a modeling break when I did after my PhD, and I mainly I branched out in statistical mechanics. So my early faculty years were really the years when I learned all the statistical mechanics and got deeper into all this, and wrapped up a few things on quantum mechanics. And so I did a bit more philosophy of physics, and then I came back to modeling a bit later. So but I'm actually working on this now again. So, but it's sort of...
Okay, so what kinds of questions did it related to statistical mechanics? Well,
at the moment, I'm really interested in this problem of the several formalisms that I mentioned before, together with my colleague Charlotte Werntel, who is now in Salzburg, but who was a colleague of mine at the LSE. I'm working on this issue of the Gibbs formalism versus the Boltzmann formalism. There's this situation that really bothers me. So you have this plethora of approaches in statistical mechanics, but you can sort of group them under sort of two family headings. They're all either sort of Boltzmannian or the Gibbsian. And these approaches are really different. So they're even formally different. It's not just that you sort of spin the story differently. So you have a different formal apparatus. But if that's supposed to be the same theory, then how can there be sort of different formal apparatus? And this is in particular worrisome because when you ask physicists to tell you a foundational story, if you ask them sort of why does statistical mechanics work, so mostly they tell you a Boltzmannian story. But then if they have to go into calculations, they typically use the Gibbs machine, which is, for a number of reasons, more powerful when it comes to applications. But you can't use one formalism to tell a story how the theory works and another one to do your calculations. At the very least, you would want to know how they relate to one another. And this problem has been bothering me for a while. And, well, I shouldn't say too much here because maybe I think everything we've been doing the last few months is going nowhere and then it's on record.
Well, I'll be interested. So
at least at the moment, Charlotte and I think we're up to something, and we have sort of a coherent story to tell about how these formalisms relate to one another.
Fantastic. And so can we expect something in the form of maybe a paper or
Yeah, I'm working on a big 2-part paper at the moment. So the first part is pretty much written, and the second we're just racking our brains over at the moment. So that, probably Charlotte is more optimistic than I am, so she probably thinks it's done sometime in early summer, so I think it's done sometime in early fall.
Very nice.
But that's sort of the time scale we're looking at, hopefully. Okay. And then we submit it to a journal and hope we're lucky.
So I've noticed on your page here that, in addition to an extensive research career, and I'm interested to ask further about this, you have quite a bit of teaching involved, taught a number of different courses over the last few years, summer school teaching. You have a very nice list of PhD students. How's been your experience as an educator?
Oh, good. I like teaching. So I like teaching the introduction to philosophy of science. So I think that's great. And sort of unlike some colleagues, I actually like undergraduate teaching. Yeah. So I think the kids are great. You get them when they're young and sort of they're basically uncut diamonds, or that's how I like to think about them. So you get them when they're young and enthusiastic. They don't know much, but they have minds, and so you can get them to think about issues that you find interesting yourself, and I think that's great. I really love it. So it's it's great to teach PhDs and master students and so on, but I actually really enjoy the undergraduate teaching. So you sort of introduce young people to a field and you try to convey your enthusiasm for it, and hopefully some of it is contagious. That's great. And then, of course, it's good to work with advanced students. I mean, with master and then PhDs, you can work on specific research questions with them. And some PhD students have become collaborators. So we really started working on projects jointly and wrote papers with them. That has been very, very rewarding in many ways.
Yeah. So, in a typical semester or a typical year, do you have a couple graduate students under your wing? How does the mentorship for you work?
Yeah, it depends a bit, obviously, what your other arrangements are. But sort of in a year where you have no teaching buyouts and no sabbaticals, you would basically teach 2 courses. So that meant you give the lecture and you teach the graduate seminars, and you have a graduate student teaching the undergraduate seminar. And then you always have a few master students writing their master dissertation with you, and you have a few PhD students. So
wow.
Well, that varies between. At some point, I think I had 7 PhD students. That
was my.
So now it's more manageable. I have 2, and one will finish next year, and they get 2 new ones. So next year I'll have 3. So that sounds about the right size of the cohort.
Very nice, very nice. And I also see here that you've done a few visiting professorships, different places. The Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, Rotman Institute of Philosophy in Ontario. Are these times where you'll take, during sabbatical years, semesters abroad? Yeah,
that's right. So, you can obviously use your sabbatical to go somewhere else, which is always good. I think it's always good to go somewhere else because you're thrown into a different pond and you have to swim differently. So it's good to see what other people do and how they think and see how other places operate, etc. But it's also good to just get away from your usual environment. It's just to freeze the spirit and also freeze some time. So you have a good excuse not to do certain things.
You're like, I'm sorry, I'm away.
Yeah, exactly. You get these emails, and then you can say, I would love to chair this lecture, but I'm away.
I'm very busy at this new. Yeah. Did you have a favorite place you visited?
No, I mean maybe that's a lack of discrimination, but I sort of managed to find something positive everywhere I went, and I mean, all these places were great in their own way, and I have no regrets of having gone anywhere. And
fantastic.
So I'd like to go back to them, especially with Munich. I have sort of a permanent affiliation, so I have a permanent visiting professorship there, and I'm going there regularly, and that's just a very interesting group with a lot of people who work on similar topics, and so it's always good to talk to them.
Oh, and how was? I didn't realize there was a history and philosophy of science program in Barcelona. I didn't realize. Oh, is it in English? Is it taught in English or is it mainly in Spanish?
No, it's completely in English. So this is the Logos group, which is sort of a general group for analytical philosophies. And I think the bulk of people there do philosophy of language, metaphysics, things like that. But they have sort of a subgroup that does philosophy of science, and it's a really good group. And I love to go to Barcelona now. And the master program is in English, and they have international students, and most of the teaching's in English, so it's no problem at all. I think they like English anyway because it's neutral between Spanish and Catalan. So.
You're right.
It actually works well in many ways.
I remember I visited there, and it seems like folks, the younger folks, are pretty well versed in English, and both Catalan and Espanol, or Castellano, I should say.
Yeah.
Well, let's. I'm really curious about. You've mentioned the past 5 and 6 years. You've come up. You continuing your study in statistical mechanics and modeling, but your modeling has shifted to then focusing on climate modeling, which is a subject that a number of philosophers of science who have, for example, like one of my committee members, Elizabeth Lloyd, has turned to start doing climate modeling. Does great work. So I'm curious, how does that come about, and what are you working on in terms of climate modeling?
Yeah, but actually, for once, I have a genealogical story to tell here. So,
okay, great.
This was funny enough. There was a general modeling conference in the Netherlands in Tilburg, and there was this climate physicist Lenny Smith, who has an interest in philosophy. And he was in the audience, and sort of he came up to me after my talk and said, "It's really interesting. We should talk more about this." And then we figured out we actually work at the same institution, but we had to meet at the conference abroad to know this. And so he was very interested still is interested in general methodological issues in model constructions and in the limits of a predictability or a projectability, one should say, context of models. And so we started talking to each other, and that developed into a proper collaboration with him and his research group.
Okay. And so what kinds of questions are then, you're curious about in terms of, or problems, issues that are going on in modeling these days?
But what interests me there is really how much one can do or what one can do with these climate models. I mean, there is a wide spectrum of things that one can do with models, from sort of very soft things like just gaining understanding of mechanisms or seeing sort of in an exemplary way certain formal features at one end, to generating very precise projections or forecasts at the other end. And there's a lot in between. And the thing sort of what Rennie and I eventually started looking at is, I mean, how far to this prediction side can you push models and still results? And that sort of sparked by a particular practical question. Well, sort of in a bracket, I should say, neither of us is a climate skeptic, just in case.
Yeah, I assume most of the folks
wrong impressions here. Sort of a philosophical engagement with climate science, like a philosophical engagement with quantum mechanics, doesn't mean you want to debunk it. You just want to understand how it works, and potentially understand its limits. And so it seemed to us that even if you have no sort of general skeptical agenda, sort of our government in particular is pushing it a bit far. So they use models, or rather they pay scientists to do these things with models, to generate high-resolution projections of very finely defined climate events.
Wow.
For instance, you can go to the website of this project called UKCP09, which is done by a government agency in the UK, and you can find on a 25-kilometer grid over the UK, you can find for each grid cell probability density functions for very finely defined events, like the temperature of the hottest day in summer 2080, things like that.
Wow.
And so we were feeling a bit queasy about this, and sort of we just, so if one wants to speak a bit loosely, just try to see where breaking point is by putting the model out to that end of the spectrum. And we are indeed skeptical about the use of models at that level of resolution.
Yeah, so this seems like they're essentially trying to sell a very high level of capability of prediction, and you're essentially saying, I don't know exactly how much we can, credibly assent to this. We spent
a great deal of time disentangling this project and looking into technical reports and figuring exactly what they do and how they do it, and we wrote a number of papers explaining why we think that this is not a good methodology. So far, unfortunately, I don't think we had much impact, because they just decided to redo the exercise, but just with different models and on a 10-kilometer grid. We're still hoping that at least some of our criticisms will gain some traction, but we'll see.
Absolutely. So, and you preface this by saying, and I, not a climate skeptic, how do you approach, as then a philosopher of science, working in a somewhat sensitive and controversial scientific area that is somewhat unfortunately seen as any sort of tension or pushback could be potentially conceived of as being a skeptic? I imagine, you as you explained to me, it seems pretty reasonable what you're doing. But I guess do you have to be careful at times in how you approach this, or?
You just unfortunately have to get thick skin.
Yeah.
You make wrong enemies and you get wrong friends. And no amount of caution or disclaimers can solve this problem. So people hear you sing on the internet and they sort of pick a sound bite out of it, and you get hate mail about it. and you get the wrong fan mail too.
Yeah, I was going to say, they see part of your clip and they're like, oh, well, and you're like, that's not what I'm doing, but of course.
Yeah, exactly. And so it just brings home how hard it is, even in philosophy, to hold something like, well, what I would call a sensible middle ground. So you have friends and foes on either side that you wouldn't really need to have, and but I think you just got to live with it. So all I can do is try to explain my point and explain it again and explain it clearly.
Yeah.
I typically, before I start my talks, I have a sort of a disclaimer and say that nothing that I said should be understood as a statement of general climate skepticism. I have no beef with the general claims of climate science. I mean, whatever you take these to be, but also if you mean by them that this is sort of the statement that global warming is a reality. Well, I think people misunderstand that. And,
I mean, you make it very nicely in your website. You know, claiming that we have to relinquish unreasonable demands for detailed long-term projections and instead think about policymaking under conditions of uncertainty, which I can imagine isn't a particularly popular opinion with folks who, and I think with people who like to make policymaking under conditions of certainty or near certainty. Yeah. And
it's actually sort of a vicious circle. So there is sort of a management cartel, one could call it. So politicians love certainties because it gets them off the hook. They can just say, look, we're the good guys. We're doing all the scientific evidence-based policy making that you want. We have best science. Best science says X. We act on X. So no one can blame us for anything. So then they eventually go out and find someone who tells them X. And obviously the scientists all need grants. You need money to do things. And so there is a temptation then to overpromise. And at least in the UK, there's a lot of bad blood about this project that I mentioned, UKZIP 09, because a number of climate scientists came out and said, I mean, look, you can't do this. I mean, this is just asking for the impossible. And obviously they went empty-handed because someone said we can do it and they got the money. Of
course, yeah.
So there is this sort of circle that politicians like to push off responsibility, and scientists obviously need money to do things, and sort of they feed off each other in a sense. And I think this is a circle that has to be broken. Scientists should be very honest about what you can't do, and that's not a failure of science. I mean, science is not crystal ball reading. Science does the best science can do, but that doesn't mean you can forecast absolutely everything. So one should communicate clearly what the uncertainties are. One should communicate clearly what one can and cannot do, and then it's a political discussion that one has to have about how to deal with that. Are we massively conservative and use something like the precautionary principle and sort of adjust absolutely everything to the worst possible outcome? Or do we some expected utility? Then obviously, what's your utility function? Or do you take riscs? And you say, look, somehow we figure it out. I don't think there is one clear answer what one should do. I mean, I have a personal view, but I'm not claiming this is the only reasonable view. But at least one should have a discussion about it.
Absolutely. And
the thing that gets me with this false precision is that it kills these sort of discussions. I think it's a discussion a society has to have about how you manage uncertainty and how you deal with what you don't know and how much risk is a society willing to take. And these are serious questions, and that's a discussion one has to have in the political arena. And at the moment, politicians just basically duck out of it, which I think it's not a good thing.
Well, I'm wondering, I'm not sure. So in the United States, we have a lot of popular science champions who might admit the uncertainty of science, but really advocate science as this almost certainty-seeking practice that maybe not certainty-seeking, but that is what is our best effort to provide us with certainty. And so it's really putting this value of certainty, it's kind of reaffirming it, and thus it's difficult for individuals to then accept. It's more of a form of scientism, I would think. And
it's the wrong form of scientism. Look, I'm a scientist in that sense. I mean, I think the best knowledge we can get about the world is scientific knowledge. There's no question about it.
Absolutely.
And whoever denies that is simply deluded. But that doesn't mean that we get Cartesian certainties. And so those people who go out and defend the value of science against religious fanatics and other irrationalists by saying science provides the certainties we need are really doing a disservice to science. You can't make good on that.
Yeah.
We know from the history of science that nothing is untouchable, and we may have to revise our views. That doesn't mean that everything is as good as everything else, so that we may have to rethink parts of physics or parts of biology at some point doesn't mean that sort of any idea that someone can come up with is just as good as modern molecular biology. But sort of framing this defense in terms of we give you certainties is a bad idea, and it will be a boomerang at some point. So I think at this point science have to be protected against its advocates as much as its defenders.
How does that happen? I mean, I've seen a lot of these advocates lately, and people in philosophy of science will point these things out. But how does that? How do we do that? How do we keep talking like this? Be more vocal about it.
I can talk to people like you and hope someone listens to the podcast.
That is the hope. Absolutely.
I can go out and tell it to anybody who wants to listen. One can write letters to journals. A friend of mine is just writing a letter to Nature about this.
Oh, perfect.
We can, of course, put up resistance.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, look, this is a free society, fortunately, and everybody can say what they want to say. So I don't think we should have something like the Inquisition. It's nothing you can do. You can stop people from saying these things. I just think it's a bad thing to say, and it's a bad way of defending the value of science, which I, of course, thoroughly believe in. So.
Yeah, of course. Well, perhaps this will take us into, somewhat seamlessly transition into the, the question related to, what have you come to see as, some of the main challenges facing philosophy of science today?
I've been thinking about that. I mean, there's, of course, all the internal questions in the field that we debate, but setting these aside, that's our daily bread and butter. So one thing I'm worried about is the increasing fragmentation of the field. In a sense, it started in the 1970s when philosophy of language and philosophy of science started to go in separate ways. I mean, if you think back to people like Carnap and Hempel and the early greats of philosophy of science, there were also the greats of philosophy of language and logic and many other things. And then at some point in the 70s or 80s, maybe philosophers of language went their own way and philosophers of science went another way. And then sort of the field starts splitting. So you then have the philosophies of the special sciences, you do philosophy of physics and the philosophy of biology. And this now splits even internally. So people do philosophy of space-time and philosophy of quantum mechanics, philosophy of statistical physics, and the biologists have their own way of breaking it up. So we're getting increasingly to a point that, certain scientific disciplines have already reached, namely that you just don't understand anymore what your colleagues do. effect of that is also that one loses a bit the middle ground. So increasingly, I can't help the feeling that sort of general philosophy of science is sort of dwindling a bit, and the action is increasingly in sort of the philosophy of the special sciences. If you look at PSA programs, huge streams in philosophy of physics and huge streams in philosophy of biology, and I mean, few discussions about problem of induction. I mean, they still exist, of course, but it's momentum is diverted away from the middle, as it were, and so certain coherence is lost. And this is just an intuitive feeling. I feel this is a bad thing. I mean, obviously the science have reached a point long ago. I mean, the times where you can be a biologist and a physicist are over. I mean, these days you even have to specialize in one branch of physics, and in the life sciences, specialization is so advanced that people often are experts of a particular molecule, and that's really what they know about. And I mean, maybe 5 other people in the world do, and no one else understands what they're doing. And
so
I'm not sure it's science, but I feel it's certainly bad for philosophy. I think in philosophy we would have to maintain a certain sense for broader visions, and a certain sense of cohesion, and a certain sense of working on a shared project. And look, I don't know how to maintain this. I mean, I'm as guilty as everybody else in driving these developments. We're all perpetrators and victims at the same time. It's just something that does give me headaches.
Yeah, no, I can understand. And so it's interesting that I've, in my own curriculum, I've had faculty who have put actually some value in the hyperfragmentation, in understanding that doing, general philosophy of science, making claims about science as if all of these sciences adhere to some of the same principles is actually the wrong way to go, and that focusing on individual sciences individually would help us to better understand these sciences, as they loosely relate, but still have their own particularities. I mean, how would you respond to something like that?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, the complaint about the loss of unity of the discipline doesn't mean we need a philosophy like falsificationism. Or
sure, you're right. That's a good distinction.
Absolutely everything, but if we have reached a point where someone who worries about philosophy of statistical physics and someone who worries about philosophy of genetics literally can't talk to each other anymore, they've reached a point where we don't even understand each other's problems anymore. I mean, then we can't even say anymore these sciences work differently. It's just like saying apples and pears are different and blah. Yes, sure. But that's not an interesting statement. Even if you want to say that, look, they don't fit into the same mold, biology work, or that particular part of biology works this way and physics works that way, means that you should have comparative categories in place and at least have a shared question in mind. And if you're losing that, you're just staring blank. And I don't think we have quite reached that point yet, but I think we're converging towards it.
Sure.
And I think that is worrisome. So we should maintain a degree of unity that at least we understand each other's problems, we understand each other's positions, and then we can have a meaningful conversation about how different fields are different.
That's a really good point. I've heard other individuals have mentioned the problem of the hyperfragmentation or hyperspecialization, but explaining it as you have is, I think, important. So thank you for that. Thanks. Roman, I really appreciate over the past hour getting to hear your story and chat about some of your particular thoughts and ideas regarding the state of the field, climate science. Is there anything else you'd like to add or mention?
No, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I really enjoyed that. It was much easier than I thought it would be.
Oh, you were great. Yeah, I can understand.
Myself always give me the creeps, but
I understand. It's going to be
smoothly. So thank you so much for shepherding me through this.
Absolutely.
So ably.
Of course. Well, no, thank you so much for coming on. I'm very excited to share the talk. I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy our conversation. So,
well, thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. If I'm ever if you're ever coming over in the way of Indiana, please say hello. If not,
likewise,
I'll have to look. Yeah.
Happy to be on the small island, let me know.
Absolutely. All right. Well, have a wonderful rest of your Friday afternoon, and I'll be in touch.
Nice talking to you.
All right. Thank you, Roman. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.